The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome to Chronic Pain, Anger, and Grief. We're glad you're here. My name is Angie Hunt, Project Manager with the Work, Wellness, and Disability Prevention Institute, formerly known as the Canadian Institute for the Relief of Pain and Disability, and I'll be moderating the webinar today. This webinar is made possible through the support of the Community Gaming Grant Program through the BC Government, as well as donations and memberships to WWDPI. We thank our program partners, Pain BC, Education Advisory Committee, and speakers who contribute to this webinar series. While we're waiting for others to join us, I'll go over a few technical points for the webinar. You should be able to hear the presentation through your computer speakers or through the conference call line if you dialed in. Please use the question box to submit any issues you may be experiencing and to ask any questions you have related to the presentation. We will collect questions submitted throughout the presentation and follow the presentation with a Q&A based on the questions submitted. Following the webinar, any questions not answered in the allotted time will be answered and distributed after the event. The presentation will be recorded and posted for free on our website within a week, along with the slides. You'll be emailed the direct links for all these items when they're available. As I mentioned, my name is Angie, and I'll be moderating the webinar and Q&A session. Our presenter today is Dr. Wesley Book. Dr. Wesley Book is a registered psychologist who practices in the area of clinical and rehabilitation psychology. In 1997, he co-founded Behavioral Health Care with an interest in individually tailored cognitive behavioral approaches to chronic conditions that emphasize the home, community facilities, and workplace as a rehabilitation clinic. Currently, Dr. Book's focus is on psycho-legal assessment and the treatment of complex forms of human suffering, such as chronic pain. He has research interests in pain-related fear and risk factors for clinical distress in caregivers and clergy. He has teaching interests in chronic pain, collaboration between psychologists and clergy, and the similarities and differences between clinical psychology and the ancient care of souls traditions of many spiritualities and religious groups. He is pleased to serve on the board of directors at Pain BC, a charitable organization dedicated to British Columbians with chronic pain. And now I'll hand it over to Wesley.
Thanks, Angie. Good morning, everyone. Hey, how about you pick a picture on the slide there about how you woke up this morning? Either way, I'm delighted you're listening in. If you're someone with chronic pain, I suspect that you have much that you could contribute to our topic today. I consider myself a channel of information. I listen to the scientific literature, but especially to my clients with chronic pain. And I thank them for their patience in helping me understand what it's like to have pain that never goes away. I hope that I do you all proud today. Thanks to Work, Wellness, and Disability Prevention Institute for inviting me to present on this topic. And thanks to Angie Hunt for being so helpful in hosting this event. And is the custom now with such presentations? I have no financial disclosures to make. I was given this topic and it caught my attention. How do pain, anger, and grief go together? Or do they? Here's my stellar business partner, Dr. Elizabeth Bannerman, on the left, and our wonderful associate, Dr. Judy LePage, on the right. They also treat clients with chronic pain. All three of us are registered psychologists in the province of British Columbia. My dog, Toffee, who apparently has been through psychoanalysis, asked me to present this slide on his behalf. Here's what I plan to say. I want to explain why chronic pain, anger, and grief go together. I want to explain why emotions matter in chronic pain. I want to describe two major factors that influence pain, anger, and grief behind the scenes. I want to introduce an adaptive view of emotions. I want to give some tips and resources regarding anger and grief, and also some resources for rage and depression. I hope that you're going to find this relevant to your learning interests today. Well, if yoga says it, that is, if Yoda says it, then it's got to be true. Here's the take-home message. Anger that festers, grief unexpressed, makes pain get louder. Anger that resolves, grief that flows, makes pain get softer, and prevents rage and depression. So do you know this phrase? How does it end? That's right. Birds of a feather flock together. I'm not sure what's going on with the penguin in this cartoon. Perhaps some sort of identity crisis? Not sure. So how do pain, anger, and grief flock together? Well, all three are meant to be helpful, in my view. They are evolved responses to help us survive and flourish in some way. That is until they're not, until they get stuck or start yelling louder and louder. All three are trying to tell us something, and their messages can help us make decisions. All three are normal. They don't need psychology until they're not normal. That's when they turn into chronic pain, rage, and depression. All can egg each other on. They can form a trio that interacts in a way that makes them worse. So who cares about emotions anyhow when you have chronic pain? This graph is from a 2012 study of acute low back pain patients divided into 4 clusters or groups, and how each cluster of pain patients fared with 8 psychosocial variables that you see around the circles or the web. The emotionally distressed group is in yellow. And this group had the poorest outcomes of all. That is, the closer to the edge of the web you get, the worse things are. So emotions matter. And in this case, emotional distress matters to rehabilitation outcomes. This is the first of 2 major factors underlying anger and grief in chronic pain. Acceptance versus change. Acceptance may bring anger. Why should I accept what's happened to me? Acceptance may bring grief because pain has cost me multiple losses with chronic pain. Change may bring all the frustration of the trial and error of new habits or goals. I would also say that acceptance can bring a sense of relief, a sense of liberation and expansion. And change can foster excitement and hope. So how do I know which is best in each situation? Do I accept this thing, or do I seek to change it? I have this limitation. Must I accept it? Is this the right thing to do, or should I work to change it? I'm going to suggest that everyone has this question when faced with a goal that is challenging. That is, everyone has what I call glass ceilings, upper limits that we can't see until we get there, and then we see. One of my favorite words is nudging. I think it's great to find out what your limits are by nudging your way there, by trying an experiment. It's kind of a trial and error approach. And the key is to go step by step, one nudge at a time, which is another way of talking about a very important word in rehabilitation, which is pacing. So first of all, a shout out to Dr. Greg Feehan for this slide. About 27 years ago, he drew this on a chalkboard, and I've never forgotten it. Pacing is about the story of the tortoise and the hare, or the turtle and the rabbit. Remember that when you were growing up. Now, who wins the race? The tortoise does, even though the bunny was much, much faster. When we don't go step by step, we are likely to have a downward trajectory of function due to pain flare-ups. So you can see the downward trajectory that starts when you're on a graduated return to work and you say, let's go for the gusto. I'm just going to show myself and everyone else that I can do this. In fact, I'll be 110% today. And what happens is that there usually tends to be a flare-up and a successive flare-ups that bring greater demoralization and a downward trajectory over time. Flare-ups are depressogenic. That is, flare-ups tend to hook depression. Now, the key move here is to choose a level of function, take for instance walking, that you can do even on bad pain days, and to add the next step up only after you're consistent on the first step, which you'll do for the rest of your life. This makes for a gradual upward trajectory towards greater function. I'll admit that it's not sexy, but it is definitely something that works in my experience. On the subject of acceptance and change, there's some great reading for you out there. Steve Hayes is a psychologist with a Buddhist orientation and the founder of acceptance and commitment therapy. There's a specific book for chronic pain using acceptance and commitment therapy as well by Wilson and Lundgren. And this takes the acceptance versus change theme and applies it to pain. So what Steve Hayes has done is make an entire therapy about this theme that underlies grief and anger. I confess that I'm also a dialectical behavior therapy fanboy. DBT offers a very helpful set of skills, some of them about what they call radical acceptance, and others derived from cognitive behavioral therapy change technology. So I highly recommend both of those books. So the serenity prayer goes, God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. So this prayer is associated with Alcoholics Anonymous and beautifully expresses the serenity, courage, and wisdom needed when considering acceptance or change. Well, it turns out that sleep, one of my favorite subjects, is really important, a major factor underlying anger and grief. First of all, pain, anger, and grief can all be exhausting. So sleep is needed. Without sleep, you're going to be grumpy just from sleep deprivation. and you will also be too tired to grieve. Now, what the chart there shows, the graphic there shows, is how pain, which is in the red line, interferes with deep sleep. Now, it says 4 stages there. The updated version of the stages is 3 stages. But deep sleep, also called slow wave sleep, also called delta sleep, which is a kind of sleep we really need for refreshment, including a biochemically refreshing sleep. And the question in working with my clients who have sleep problems because of pain is, how do you get below that red line into deep sleep? Now, you'll notice that on the left-hand side of the slide, right when you go to sleep, you get into the deepest delta or slow wave sleep of the night. And this tends to get more shallow and less prolonged as the night goes on. Whereas REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep, starts off small and gets bigger. So if we want to get refreshing sleep, at the very least, we need to get 2 or 3 sleep cycles in. So a sleep cycle is those dips and valleys. Sleep management skills. The first one is to build the sleep drive. So how do we build the sleep drive? The sleep drive occurs during the day. So it sounds weird, but when you get up in the morning, when you wake up in the morning, that's when your sleep drive starts, and it peaks just as you're going to sleep. So you build the sleep drive during the day, and you do so by getting out of bed and getting into the light and moving. Now, sleep hygiene activities, like taking a bath before bed, that sort of thing, all good, but they're no substitute for building the sleep drive. In fact, sleep hygiene stuff is minimized these days in favor of talking about how to build your sleep drive. Set a consistent wake-up time. Why? Because it helps to set your circadian clock. And then try a sleep compression technique. And the way you do this is you set a firm wake-up time. You don't go into your bedroom at night until you can hardly keep your head up. And then regardless of your sleep experience, you still get out of bed at a consistent time. And you do so for several weeks. Now, sleep compression is something my clients hate me for, but it really can be something that can make a world of difference if you stick to it. Now, I've listed some additional tips. LivePlanBe is a website I'll talk about in a bit, and you'll see the link there to sleep education. You may want a physician review of sleep medication and a possible referral to a sleep medicine. And then there is my favorite sleep researchers, who's one of our Canadian treasures, Dr. Colleen Carney, who has done lots of work in her lab on cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia. And she's actually done a webinar for our host today. And that webinar was on April the 26th, 2016. And there's the link. Highly recommended. She really knows what she's talking about. I've been to all of her workshops. We come now to an adaptive view of emotions. So I find that most of the time, emotions are intended to be helpful. Anger typically gives messages about protection. Grief gives messages about attachments or relationships or things that are really important to us, including ourselves and our bodies. That's important when we talk about chronic pain. Anger and grief both can help us make decisions, along with other sources of information. More on that in a moment. Emotions can also become unhelpful, including anger when it becomes rage and grief when it becomes depression. I find this happens usually when we don't listen to our emotional life. Then it has to yell at us. Emotions can also be unhelpful when they're based on understandings or assumptions that are incorrect or are no longer relevant to our present situation. Some psychological conditions, like depression, actually introduce distorted biases and messages. These conditions contaminate normal emotions. There's good news. Changing our thoughts, our understandings, our interpretations can change our emotions to become trustworthy and helpful once again. Emotions are like messages in a bottle. They're communications. They pop up on the sea of our consciousness like a message in a bottle in the slide there. They come from the rim of our awareness or the subterranean depths of our unconscious life. Message in a bottle, of course, is the words of a song from the Police. Sometimes these messages are old, like this fellow who found a message in a bottle on Vancouver Island on a beach there 107 years later. So an old message may be golden and just right, or it may be simply irrelevant. I believe that emotional messages belong at our decision-making table. So if you think about how we make decisions, think of a boardroom and chairs all around it, like on the slide. Emotions like pain, anger, or grief are needed to help us make decisions. Sometimes emotions bring insights we might not get from reason or other people's advice. Properly evaluated, emotions can make unique contributions, or at least corroborate what we've learned from other ways of knowing. Let's get to chronic pain and anger, which has been called Paingry. So many reasons to be angry when you have chronic pain. Can you think about some reasons to be angry from your own life these days, whether you have chronic pain or not? So I want to give you some points about anger management and see how this goes. People with chronic pain experience greater anger than community samples without pain. That makes sense. Anger arousal, this is all from the anger literature. Anger arousal is associated with greater pain intensity, muscle tension, and interference with function and relationships in time-lagged analyses, which they collect data step by step by step. The greater the anger, the greater the consequences. So just anger arousal is going to bring some kind of pain amplification and associated interference. Then there's the matter of anger regulation. And it turns out that whether you express anger, anger out, or inhibit or suppress anger, anger in, both are associated with greater pain intensity, muscle tension, and interference. So it kind of sounds like you're hooped, right, if you have chronic pain? So here's my best advice as a clinician. I'm going to suggest that blowing up at people tends to alienate them and doesn't really solve anything. Stuffing anger down and never acknowledging it simply buries problems. It leads to seething anger, which also typically alienates other people. They can feel it. Doesn't resolve anything either. Kind of bad for your health. So what I recommend is that you use some anger control and use the energy from the anger to resolve problems. So respect anger, manage it well, and use it to resolve problems. In some therapies and approaches to anger, anger is considered a secondary emotion. And when you get angry, the idea is that there's a lurker behind the scenes, a primary emotion that is showing up. So behind anger, there might be hurt, or there might be sadness. There might be grief. Anger still is viewed by many in our society as scary, unwanted, to be avoided, making the situation worse, the mark of an undisciplined or rude person. However, if you're trying to control anger all the time, you can get stuck in an endless struggle with anger. The more you struggle, the more you feel stuck. Like the person in the picture using a Chinese finger trap. Doesn't look very happy. I see anger as energy to be used to energize hope and to make a plan for change. The goal in anger management is anger that resolves a problem and then fades away. It's done its job. We become aware of anger, we name it, we validate it. Sometimes I thank it for showing up, maybe not at the time. We learn from it. We evaluate its merits, its message, and then take what is good and accurate and develop a plan. These are the major components of a typical anger management program. And of course, sometimes there's nothing you can do. If your pain is chronic, you're going to be frustrated lots of the time. Acceptance is important, and then commitment to a plan towards optimal pain management or anger management. How am I going to live with this in the best way possible? For those of you who want to know more about managing anger, you can go to PainBC's client website. I've already mentioned LivePlanBe.ca. You can look up my anger blurb there, chronic pain and anger, putting anger to work. And you can use the goal setting features on the website to set some goals related to anger management. Now, here are two workbooks that I recommend that provide anger management skills. They're both written specifically for anger from my two favorite therapies. There is acceptance and commitment therapy on the left, and there is dialectical behavior therapy on the right. Great books. We move now to chronic pain and grief. I deliberately presented on anger first because it's an emotion that provides a good bridge to grief. Anger can be a reaction to things, a reaction to functions or people that we've lost, that we miss. Anger is also the second stage of Kubler-Ross's famous grief cycle. So anger in this grief cycle is actually a part of grieving. See how the two go together. Then add chronic pain in there, and you've got your trio. Notice also how the cycle begins with denial and ends with acceptance, one of our major underlying factors of anger and grief, the theme of acceptance versus change. These 5 grief experiences may well be part of grief. I think Elizabeth Kubler-Ross has done a wonderful job of identifying experiences that people have as they grieve, and which can be experiences that they don't think have anything to do with grief. However, these experiences may not necessarily occur for everyone. Also, they may not show up in this order, which is a common problem of all stage models. But I think it's great just to look at what grief can consist of in terms of emotional experiences, so that you can identify, oh, I think I know what that is. I think if we're going to have a grief that flows, then we're going to need to give permission. So permission that's to ourselves, permission giving to grieve, permission giving at the edge of tears. Sometimes it's perfectly okay and very helpful just to let tears come. I think that sometimes one of the most important things I can do for people that have chronic pain is to help them give themselves permission in a safe environment to express grief that they hide from others because they don't want to be a burden. Grief can raise fears of losing control and becoming lost in grief. It can raise anger at feeling weak, at feeling helpless. And it can be something that's dismissed because it feels useless. So sometimes we're up against real obstacles and even rules about emotions like grief that we might have learned by observation as we grew up. Another thing about grief that flows is that it takes time to grieve. Sometimes we get really, really busy when we're grieving because we don't want to grieve. We don't want to go there, so we just get really busy. And you know, busy can be good. It's just, can you also be flexible enough to let tears come at times when you don't find yourself busy or you don't have to be so busy? It takes time. And also, grief that flows takes a commitment on all of our parts to take extra care of ourselves when we're grieving. So what I find is that grief, when it occurs, can lead me to neglect myself. So things like eating, don't feel like eating, hydration, drinking water, movement, getting out for a walk, whatever it is. Make sure I get a good sleep, because sleep is important to give me the stamina to grieve, to reach out in connection with others. Grief that flows is grief that is shared, that is involved in the give and take of our relationships. And last but not least, spiritual activities, because grief raises questions about the meaning of our lives. And so it's good to go there. And if you have spiritual practices or religious practices, those can be very helpful. So I, as a clinician, am really interested in grief that ebbs and flows. It comes and it goes like the tide. And I'm interested in grief that is shared and expressed, not banished, disowned, or buried. This is healthy grief. It's good grief work. And so it starts with these major components of grief work: awareness. And I love that slide about masks of melancholy. You may not think you're grieving, and others may not think it either, but maybe you are. You name it, you validate what it is, you learn from it, you evaluate it, you make a plan, and of course, you may need to accept. I really like this slide. This is grief, loss, and chronic pain. And so the theory goes that at the common core is an existential vacuum containing emptiness, vulnerability, and exhaustion. Grief seeks meaning, as I just mentioned, and I recommend Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning. Meaning is often intertwined with spiritual and religious beliefs and practices, which can, not always, but can be helpful. And if you're interested in this subject, by all means go to LivePlanBe.ca and you can look up my two-part webinar on spirituality and chronic pain, finding meaning in misery. In that, I go over an actual case study of a Muslim client I had who had chronic pain. Buddhist psychology has given us such treasures in our work with people who suffer, and Buddhism was originally conceived as a method for living in an existence where suffering was the norm. And of course, mindfulness is a big part of the method in this approach. So to the left of the screen, I can't really say enough about the mindfulness-based stress reduction program. And there's a workbook out in a month, in December, about this approach for grief specifically. Then there's a book that's already out by Dr. Kumar, who has written about grief that never seems to end using the same mindfulness-based approach. Now, I'm going to see whether or not I can get this video to work. I hope you enjoy it. Here we go. Great. I hope that worked. And we are going to move on. I'm just wanting to tell you that Ariel Levy is a writer who lost her husband, son, and house within a 2-month period. I think about the application of her story to folk with chronic pain. And when you have chronic pain and it goes on, sometimes you do lose people. My clients tell me that they can lose friends. They can lose partners. There's a higher divorce rate. But also, they tell me that they can lose their selves, that is, their old self and their old life. So I thought that this would be an encouragement to all of you that find yourself in a place of grief. I'm going to move on now for the final part of this to two other conditions, rage and depression. When anger turns into rage, so chronic pain plus rage really equals becoming like a leper, or at the low end of a caste system, which that book is written on there in the slides, an untouchable. You don't want to be touched, and nobody else wants to touch you either. So you become detached, disconnected, disowned from others and yourself. And then there's all the destruction that happens in your internal life. Chronic pain and rage also put a person at risk for a certain kind of depression called agitated depression. This is an angry, seething, volatile depression I often see in men, especially with chronic pain, particularly associated with pain flare-ups and impulsive, aggressive behavior. Then there's what happens when grief turns into depression. And I want to talk about chronic pain plus stagnant grief. What is stagnant grief? Grief is meant to be adaptive. It brings the psychic pain of loss for sure, but grief also brings new appreciation of life, new insight, a new beginning. Stagnant grief is dead. It's a dead end. It has no flow, no ebb and flow. Does not bring any new awareness or appreciation of life. It's not engaged with. It just lies dormant. Stagnant grief, in my view, begins a disappearing act. That is, stagnant grief, like chronic pain, disappears you. Emotionally and in other ways, a person with stagnant grief begins to fade, to become a ghost, like the woman in the picture. Chronic pain plus stagnant grief can also bring a melancholic depression. This is another form of depression, a particular kind of sorrowful, wasting depression. And in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual 5, this is the kind of like Bible for diagnosis in psychiatry and to a certain extent in psychology. In the DSM-5, there is a specifier for major depression called with melancholic features. So listen to the language used in the DSM to describe these melancholic features. Quote, a distinct quality of depressed mood characterized by profound despondency, despair, and or moroseness, or by so-called empty mood. Loss of pleasure in all or almost all activities. Lack of reactivity to things usually found pleasurable. Significant anorexia or weight loss. Excessive or inappropriate guilt. And wouldn't you know it, melancholic depressions are difficult to treat. So I love this slide. It's from my wife, Paula. Come on, inner peace, I don't have all day. What do I do with rage and depression? The best I can do for today with rage and depression is to point you to resources that I recommend from all that I know. These go from most convenient and free to less convenient and not free. On our host website, we have a number of very helpful webinars of relevance to our topic. I've listed some on the left-hand side. You've got the URL at the top. I found Dr. Pincus's webinar on pain-related distress and her development on a special pain-related depression very interesting indeed. Then there's the People in Pain website webinars, and I note in particular that Cara Hawley, a UBC psych student, who I believe lives with chronic pain, presents on chronic pain and grief, and also on conflict, which of course is associated with anger. So here are two presentations very close to our own today from a person with chronic pain. Highly recommend you give it a good listen. Then there's PainBC's LivePlanBe website for individuals with chronic pain. It's my pleasure to serve on the board of directors for PainBC. I have contributed various things on the LivePlanBe website for people with chronic pain. So what you do is you go to the website, you go to the tab that says Manage My Pain. You see it there on the slide, upper left. And you can do a self-assessment there and then set some goals towards things like resolving anger or expressing grief. It's really kind of a unique approach. I'm really quite thrilled with it. I use it with clients too, by the way. You might want to join a group. So here's a self-management group. It's free, funded by the government. It's peer-led, time-limited, and it follows a curriculum all about chronic pain self-management. And they're sprinkled throughout the city and the province. Find one that's local and give it a try. Here's People in Pain's network. So People in Pain has numerous chronic pain education and support groups, they're called. So find one that's closest to you and sign up. You'll get education and you'll get to know other people and get some good support happening. Well, last but not least, this is a shameless plug for my profession. You can usually get some sessions for free if you have an extended health plan. Some of my colleagues use a sliding scale or do pro bono work. Please stay connected, just like you're doing today. I know it can be difficult for all sorts of reasons, but chronic pain brings a certain loneliness all of its own. So don't close the blinds, let some light get in by staying connected. Here's what I've tried to say. I hope I got it all in. I think I did. We'll give Yoda the final say. This, of course, comes directly from Yoda. And that's it for me, almost, because it's time for questions.
Thank you, Dr. Book. We have, to our audience, if you have any questions at this time, please enter them into the question and answer box on the GoToWebinar panel and we'll answer them out loud. Some questions that come in. One of our audience members suffers from chronic pain and was sure they had reached a level of acceptance with their disabilities, but now I'm back to feeling loss, grief, and greater depression due to my inability to function. Is it normal to regress?
Yeah, I wouldn't really call that regression. I would just call it normal grief. I think that's why Elizabeth Kubler-Ross talks about a grief cycle as well as stages. You know, there are both philosophers and there are very thoughtful psychologists and psychiatrists who believe that grief is with us through life. That grief is something that we're all going to be dealing with as soon as the cord gets cut from our mothers at birth. Life is a succession of little griefs and losses. Of course, it's not only that, but it's also that. It's like life and death. They kind of go together. And grief and hopefully joy can also go together in life. Have you ever noticed how people can feel happy and sad at the same time? It's true, you know. So it's not about regression. It's about you being attentive and giving yourself permission. So congrats on exploring more, or at least listening to more messages that come from grief in your interior life, and a new opportunity for another round of grieving. So rest up and reach out, take good care of yourself, and let ebb and flow that grief of yours. Let it come and go.
Another question that came in, could you elaborate more about the sleep drive, how you introduce the topic, for example, to your clients, and how you assign homework for them to incorporate this?
Right. So glad you asked that question, because I'm a sleep nerd. I got into sleep just by absolute accident when I took a course from Dr. Jonathan Fleming at UBC. And this was in psychiatry, and found out that he was a sleep disorders clinic director, and then took some course at work and practicum from him. He's also by the way, on PainBC's website doing a webinar. Absolutely fantastic. Chronic pain and sleep. Anyhow, here we go. The sleep drive. Yeah, so it begins when we wake up in the morning, and it doesn't make sense, does it? Because we're supposed to be awake. But that's when the sleep drive actually begins. And I suggest to people that it's actually more important what they do during the day than what they do before bed. Now, what they do before bed can make a difference, as we all know. But certainly, I introduce things like, how are people structuring their day? Are they getting outside into light? If they're not, do they have a light lamp, which they can buy? So light helps. It triggers the sleep, wake up circuitry of the brain, and movement really helps. Doing the normal things like eating and drinking really helps. Social interaction really lights up our brain, and that's really good for us. So that will extend, certainly that will increase some sleep drive. Of course, you've always got the help of pain, which is going to also contribute. And we're talking about anger and grief today, and that contributes. So just living life during the day with chronic pain is also going to contribute to the sleep drive. And so that's the kind of homework I give. It's about how can a person get into the light, which is a nice metaphor, isn't it? But I mean literally, and also move more, interact with people, that sort of thing.
Okay, another question that came in. Dr. Book, can you explain the role of peer pressure in experiencing grief, i.e. a man never cries?
Yeah, that's, so I was born in the 50s, and that's one of the things that I learned. I'm hoping that kind of a rule is changing, but it certainly is out there. Peer support or peer pressure is definitely a thing. And you really will need to decide what kind of rules you are wanting to follow. Just the fact that you are questioning right now means that you have found a rule. You become aware of a rule about grieving, for instance, that you might not have known before. The rule that I find even more annoying is that when people tell you to stop grieving, you're done. I don't know if you've had that rule put on you by peers, but they're kind of done with you grieving. Okay, you've had your, week. The boss wants you, to get back to work, or your family says, okay, it's been a month. That surely is enough. Let's not be a sad sack anymore and get on with things. And so that's a kind of peer pressure that can interrupt grief. These are all things to be negotiated. So I really hope that you will negotiate with your own self at your own decision-making table, in your mind, about where and in what circumstances it's going to be okay to give yourself permission to grieve, even if it's not okay with peers. and to negotiate with loved ones, to say, yes, I know, I'm still grieving. This may continue for some time, but I'm just going to go with it. But I'm also aware of other things like your love for me.
Okay, we did have a few other questions that came in, but in the interest of time, I'll end the webinar and send those to Dr. Book and the answers in your follow-up email. Dr. Book, is there anything you would like to add following your presentation?
Just my thanks again for asking me to present on chronic pain, anger, and grief. I hope it's been helpful. And thanks to everyone who's tuned in. And again, to all of you who experience chronic pain every day, and the many clientele that I've seen who are also tuning in today. Thanks so much.
Yes, and thank you, Doctor, for your presentation.